Shayna Rosenbaum, and her title is Understanding Vaccine Compliance, Insight from the Behavioral Sciences. Shayna Rosenbaum is a professor and York Research Chair in the Department of Psychology and Vision Science to Applications, the VISTA program at York University, and is an associate scientist at the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest. She's published extensively on the topics of memory and decision-making and has received awards for her neuroimaging and patient research, including a Sloan Research Fellowship and Early Career Awards from the Canadian Association for Neurosciences, Canadian Society for Brain Behavior and Cognitive Scientists. Her research is funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research and Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. And she's an elected member of the Royal Society of the Canada College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists, and is a past member of the Board of Trustees and Ontario Science Centre. So welcome, particularly interesting with background in clinical neuropsychology with the College of Psychologists. So this is such an important area, and it's really great to have you join us, Shayna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak to you today. And I think actually this talk fits really well following the talk that Roxanne gave and Clementine. It was excellent. We actually have some data that I'm not going to be presenting today relating to protective behaviors. So perhaps in the question and answer period, I can speak to that. But as reinforced in yesterday's talks, widespread vaccination is of course necessary to minimize or halt the effects of many infectious diseases, including of course COVID-19. And we might expect greater disparities in vaccine compliance as new variants of concern emerge and as boosters become more widely available and of course recommended. So the question that we've been wondering about is how might we predict, prevent, and possibly even correct vaccine hesitancy and unwillingness? So today, as indicated by my title, I'll argue that research on future decision-making, especially the tendency to discount future rewards, which is known as delay discounting, can inform how we approach and understand the decision to be vaccinated. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been many instances of having to make intertemporal choices between smaller, sooner rewards, such as in this depicted in this picture, enjoying friends but at a physical distance, and larger later rewards, such as being able to gather more closely with others indoors. We have also made choices between receiving a smaller monetary reward, for example, due to operating a restaurant at half capacity, and larger monetary rewards in the future when we're able to return to normal. And this also seems to apply to the decision to be vaccinated, as indicated by this advertisement from Honor Health, which really shows you the short-term smaller rewards or even losses versus the longer-term rewards, which of course are greater, especially avoiding transmitting the virus to vulnerable populations, which isn't of course included in this list to the right, and also avoiding long COVID, which we heard about yesterday in some of the talks. So intertemporal choice, or choosing between a smaller sooner reward versus a larger later reward, is often tested in the lab using hypothetical monetary rewards. So in our paradigm, and in paradigms that are often used, we vary the amount of the immediate reward, so in this case, $1,000 now, and the delay between receiving that smaller immediate reward versus the larger later reward, so $2,000 in 3 years. And numerous studies have shown that there is a normal tendency to discount the value of the larger future reward with increasing delay, which seems quite obvious. But what we're concerned about is a greater tendency to discount the value of the larger future reward. And so that's what we tend to measure in the lab. And so this really just depicts a steep discounting curve, which really indicates a sharper decline in the subjective valuation of rewards. And this has been shown to be associated with financial hardship and also health issues, which of course have been heightened during the pandemic, including heightened anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, addictions, and so on. You're probably wondering why I'm speaking only about behavior when I am a clinical neuropsychologist by training, and the work that we conduct in my lab is in the area of cognitive neuroscience. Before the pandemic, we had been very interested in whether delay discounting predicts certain types of neurological conditions, and really to understand the neurocognitive basis of steep delay discounting. And what we found, and this is actually a study that was led by a graduate student of mine, Jenkin Mock, is that a region of prefrontal cortex is associated with very steep discounting. So patients who have lesions to this region tend to discount a larger later reward more steeply than control participants, who here are indicated by the line with the open squares, and a different patient group with damage to a region known as the hippocampus, which is a region that is highly vulnerable to a range of neurological conditions, including Alzheimer's disease. But it turns out that patients with lesions to this region, which affects memory and even the ability to imagine the future, nevertheless show a normal tendency to discount the future, and it's similar to controls. What's very important about delay discounting is that it's a promising behavioral marker, well, hopefully it's a promising behavioral marker of vaccine compliance, because it has been shown to be modifiable. So the individuals that I mentioned before who show steep discounting actually can be relieved of their steep discounting by providing them with a cue to imagine a specific future event when they're making a decision between choosing a smaller immediate reward and a larger later reward. So an example of a cue might be to imagine one's 40th wedding anniversary that will take place 3 years from now. And then to make the decision between receiving the smaller immediate reward, $1,000 now, versus $2,000 in 3 years. And of course, we can vary the amounts and the delays. And this has been shown actually in multiple labs. This is just an example of the effects of cueing on discounting performance. So the dotted line indicates control participants are actually healthy young adults who discount the future in a typical way. But when we give them the cue to imagine a particular future event that might occur when receiving the reward, we find that their discounting, even though they were not atypical in their discounting, they actually show even shallower discounting. So it really does have a nice effect on helping people to really think and consider future rewards. And this has been shown in a range of patient populations. This is a study that we had conducted. This again was led by my student Jenkin Mock in a separate study, where he showed that both young adults, as indicated on the left-hand side, and older adults do benefit from cues. It looks like older adults benefit less than younger adults, although the difference between their standard and cue discounting is significant. But that is because in standard discounting without the cues, older adults are actually more shallow in their discounting compared to young adults. So it really can only bring you so high, the cues. This is yet another example in the patient population that I mentioned earlier with lesions to a region of prefrontal cortex, ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And these individuals show abnormally steep discounting, normally as indicated by the black line, the solid black line in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex patients. But when these patients are cued to imagine future events, they actually perform in a way that really considers the future to a greater extent, as indicated by the solid blue line. And you can see this relative to the control participants indicated by the black and the blue dotted lines for standard and cue discounting respectively. This study was led by a colleague of mine at University of Bologna, Elisa Charmelli, and it was very recently published. So we wanted to determine how delay discounting might serve as a useful marker of vaccine compliance. The question is, are people who decide to remain unvaccinated more likely to discount future rewards more steeply and to opt for the smaller immediate reward? And it's really important, of course, to account for financial hardship and psychological distress and other variables that we know have been elevated during the pandemic, and that we also know are strongly associated with delay discounting. We had the opportunity to test a multi-nation sample of actually over 5,000 participants. After cleaning the data to remove participants who didn't comply with test instructions or who failed attention checks, we ended up with a sample of just under 4,500 participants. And I'll mention the countries in a moment. We asked participants to fill out a variety of surveys, some relating to demographic variables, as you can see here. So we asked about gender, age, highest level of education, secondary, so high school, undergraduate or postgraduate degrees, their rating of subjective income, so their view of their own income relative to what they view the country mean to be, essential worker status, and psychological distress, which was actually captured by ratings on a generalized anxiety disorder scale, the GAD-7, and the patient health questionnaire scale, which measures depressive symptoms, the PHQ-9. We combined these two measures into a single index because they were highly correlated with one another. And the unvaccinated group, I should mention, included subgroups. So those who reported that they were unvaccinated and not planning to be vaccinated, and a separate group who reported that they were unvaccinated and planning to be vaccinated. But at the time that we tested participants, there was actually widespread availability of vaccines in most countries from which we sampled, and we found no significant differences between the two unvaccinated groups, so I'm going to be reporting them together here. In terms of vaccinated groups, those included individuals who were partially and fully vaccinated at the time. And you can see that there's a relatively even split in terms of reported gender. Age was on the lower side, even though we sampled from 18 to age 85, we ended up with most participants around age 30 in both groups. Highest level of education, we had most of our participants in both groups had an undergraduate education. Income was mild to moderate, sort of medium in both groups. And not surprisingly, our vaccinated sample had more essential workers than our unvaccinated sample. And psychological distress was higher in the unvaccinated group compared to the vaccinated group. We analyzed data from participants who were recruited from 13 industrialized countries, as depicted here, that varied in terms of COVID-19 case severity at the time of testing. So participants were tested actually there were several groups of participants tested at different time points. I'm reporting data from participants who were tested between the June 27th and July 16th of 2021. And as seen here, our regional COVID-19 severity index, it represents the nation's component score from a principal components analysis of weekly COVID-19 cases and death rates, total cases and deaths since the first week of 2020, and population adjusted total cases, deaths per 100,000. The nation specific data were extracted from the European CDC, and the data were extracted for each participant at the time that they were tested, so within the week that they were tested, actually. I also wanted to show the relative vaccination rates across countries. So the top view shows countries from which we sampled and their average percent across, this is the actual vaccination rates within each country at the time of testing, at the time that we tested each participant. And underneath is the reported vaccination rates from each country. So there was relatively good correspondence. There were some differences. Importantly, the range of vaccination rates for the country level population statistics ranged from 15 to 70%. Our sample ranged from 13 to 88%. So 13% associated with countries like New Zealand to 88%, including Canada. So we had fewer individuals to sample from who were unvaccinated at the time, which of course is reassuring for us. We then, in addition to the surveys and the psychological distress measures that I mentioned, we administered a measure of intertemporal choice. So it's very similar to what I described before, and across 42 trials, participants were asked to decide between a smaller immediate reward and a larger delayed reward, with the immediate reward amount and the delayed reward amount varied across trials. And we used an adjusting amount procedure in which the amount of the immediate reward was increased or decreased based on the participant's previous choice at that delay, converging on the amount of the immediate reward that was equivalent in subjective value to the delayed reward. So we were basically looking for the indifference point in participants' choices. And I'm going to be describing, so the index of discounting that we used is area under the curve, which represents the area under the observed subjective values. And we use it because it provides a single theoretically neutral measure of the degree of discounting. And so just to mention that both subjective value and delay are normalized for the purposes of calculating area under the curves, AUCs. And as a result, AUC ranges from 0, which would indicate maximally steep discounting, so always choosing the smaller immediate reward, to 1, which would indicate no discounting, always choosing the larger later reward. Okay, I know this is a little bit busy, but I just wanted to highlight that we analyzed our data with multi-level logistic regression with vaccination status, unvaccinated versus vaccinated, as the outcome variable, and age, education, income, distress index, essential worker status, and area under the curve as predictors, to account for possible systematic differences across countries. For example, COVID-related severity, which I presented before, population vaccination rates, and even government response. Each participant's vaccination status was nested within country. And as you can see here, many of the variables predict vaccination status in a positive way. And in fact, we find that even still, delay discounting predicts the decision to remain unvaccinated. So individuals who discount smaller rewards to a greater extent are more likely to be unvaccinated. And this was over and above the other variables. And so this is depicted graphically. So you can see that the vaccinated individuals who are indicated by the lighter blue line discount future rewards to a lesser extent. So there's a slightly shallower curve compared to individuals who remain unvaccinated. And this was true even when we unpacked the unvaccinated and vaccinated groups, the unvaccinated into those who were planning to be vaccinated and those who planned not to be vaccinated. It did not seem to matter in this case. I also wanted to mention that we tested a separate group of participants a month later, just to see if our findings held. And we ended up with a sample of just under 2,500 participants. The split in gender was actually a little bit different. There were actually differences across our variables. And yet we still found that, that discounting predicted vaccination status over and above the other variables, or at least when we account for the other variables. This is just to show you again that, so on the top you see regional severity. So there were some changes in regional severity across month. And I should have mentioned that end of June, beginning of July was following, so it wasn't during the peak of Delta, but it was following the peak. And there were some government responses that varied across countries. We know that the reason we actually tested a separate group a month later is because lockdowns were imposed in Australia, and there were differences in the rates of cases and deaths that varied across country. The bottom two figures indicate the share of the population that were either partially or fully vaccinated based on population level statistics in the middle, and at the very bottom based on our own sample. So there was more variability actually, or a greater difference between the two. And yet we still found this reliable difference where individuals who are unvaccinated tended to discount future rewards to a greater extent, as indicated here by the purple line, compared to individuals who are vaccinated, indicated by the gold line. So just to conclude from these data, steeper delay discounting is found to relate to a variety of demographic factors and psychological distress, which have been heightened during the pandemic. But importantly, steeper delay discounting also predicts COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy and the intention to be vaccinated. And so we view delay discounting as having diagnostic value as a sensitive marker of the effects of the pandemic. And it is identified as a target of intervention, or we believe that it should be. And just very briefly, we have also in the sample that I mentioned to you that we had tested, the 2 samples, we did a manipulation. We included a manipulation where half the sample received an event cue induction where they were cued to imagine a future event relating to after the pandemic ends, to think about when they were choosing between the smaller immediate reward and the larger delayed reward. And we're working through the data right now. We had a control condition where participants just had to type text just to control for typing. And we have found actually, so this is area under the curve by different conditions. The control condition indicated on the very left side where individuals were not thinking about the future or cued to think about the future. And we found that there was a significant difference in our preliminary data when people were thinking about an event that is imagined to take place after the pandemic is over. So we're very hopeful that this induction will be useful in future work. And I wanted to acknowledge especially Julia Halalova, who led most of this work, and Sam Vines-Clinton, who also was involved in much of this research, and my close collaborator, Donna Rosatis, who was also a very major player in the work, and Jianhong Wu, who is here, Kai Rogeri, Len Green, and Joel Meyerson. And of course, funding agencies who supported the work, CIHR, separate work that we're doing is supported by NSERC, and the Public Health Agency of Canada, and Nick Ogden in particular, who have been wonderful partners in this research. Thank you very much.